painting that predicted 3 murders. A Sherlock Holmes story. Chapter 1. The Canvas of Calamity. It was on a particularly disagreeable Wednesday, in November, that the affair of Hargrove Gallery and its singular painting first came to our attention at Baker Street. Fog had descended upon London with unusual tenacity that morning, pressing its grey bulk against the window panes of our sitting room, as though curious about the domestic arrangements within. I had been reading the morning papers, with the comfortable half-attention of a man who expects nothing remarkable, while Holmes sat at the far end of the room performing an experiment that involved 3 glass retorts, a small spirit lamp, and an odour, which I shall charitably describe as reminiscent of the lower Nile at low tide. I had noticed, over the many years of our acquaintance, Holmes possessed a peculiar sixth sense for the approach of the extraordinary. He would sometimes lay aside his work, or pause mid-sentence, with an expression of alert attention that preceded, as surely as the overture precedes the opera, the arrival of some remarkable development. On this particular morning, he abandoned his chemical apparatus a full 3 minutes before Mrs. Hudson's footsteps became audible on the stair, stood at the mantelpiece with his pipe charged and his grey eyes fixed upon the door. "We are about to have a visitor," he remarked, that air of serene satisfaction which always accompanied his minor demonstrations of prescience. "Female, middle-aged, has recently been weeping though she is now composed, and she travels by cab rather than on foot, despite the distance being modest, suggesting either infirmity or a desire for privacy. The matter, whatever it is, has caused her considerable agitation over a period of days rather than hours." "Really, Holmes," I protested, setting aside the Illustrated London News. "You cannot possibly know all of that before the door has opened. Watch and learn, my dear Watson," he said pleasantly, as Mrs. Hudson ushered in our visitor. She was precisely as Holmes had described, a woman of perhaps 50 years, dressed in good but not extravagant mourning black, red-rimmed eyes that she had made a determined effort to render presentable. Her hands, I noticed as she took the chair Holmes indicated, clasped together with a rigidity that spoke of an effort to maintain composure under considerable strain. She was not aristocratic, but she was clearly genteel. The wife, I thought, of a professional man of some standing. "Mr. Holmes," she began. Her voice was steadier than her hands suggested it ought to be. "My name is Mrs. Cecilia Wyndham Price. My husband was Mr. Aldous Wyndham Price, the art dealer. He was found dead in his gallery 3 days ago, and the police tell me it was his heart." "But you do not believe them," said Holmes. Psst. She looked at him with an expression of mingled relief and surprise, as people often did when Holmes demonstrated that he had, first moments of an encounter, already understood their central difficulty. "No," she said, "I do not. My husband was in excellent health. Dr. Bellamy Fitch himself examined him not 6 weeks ago, and pronounced him sound as a bell. He was only 53. His father lived to 91, and the police's conclusion is founded upon what evidence? There was no mark upon him, no wound, no poison that the initial examination found. He was discovered by his assistant, young Mr. Fenton Crabbe, on Tuesday morning, slumped in his chair behind his desk. The gallery had been locked the night before. Aldous always locked it himself. The police say the evidence is consistent with cardiac failure. And what is it, Mrs. Wyndham Price, that makes you doubt this comfortable verdict?" She opened her bag and produced, somewhat trembling fingers, a folded piece of paper. "2 days before Aldous died," she said, "he received a letter. He would not show it to me, but I saw him reading it, and the colour left his face. He burned it that same evening, not before I had caught one sentence, only one, because he turned it over when he noticed I was near. The sentence I saw was this: the painting shows, so shall it be." Holmes was very still. In that perfect stillness, I recognized a quality of attention that I had learned, over the years, to identify as the highest form of his interest. "And the painting," he said. "That is the other matter. There is a painting in the gallery. A very large one, in the back room. Aldous acquired from a private estate in Devonshire about 3 months ago. I confess I had paid little attention to it, as I do not often visit the gallery. But yesterday, when I went to begin sorting Aldous' affairs, I looked at it carefully for the first time." She paused, and for a moment I thought she might weep, but she mastered herself with admirable determination. "The painting depicts 3 men, Mr. Holmes. 3 men in a library or study. 2 of them are seated. One is standing over them with his hands raised." She drew a slightly unsteady breath. "But the extraordinary thing, the impossible thing, is that the man standing over the seated figures, Mr. Holmes, he bears the face of my husband, Aldous, and both the seated men are dead." A silence settled over the room, broken only by the soft hiss of Holmes's pipe and the distant sound of a cart rumbling along Baker Street below. "Both the seated men," repeated slowly. "You are certain of this? Mr. Creighton Aldgate, a solicitor, an old friend of Aldous', died of apoplexy last month, and Sir Rowland Fenwick, a collector, very wealthy, very prominent, died a fortnight ago in his estate in Surrey. Both deaths were considered natural. Both men appear in this painting. Now Aldous is dead too. The painting, Mr. Holmes, appears to have predicted all 3 deaths." Holmes turned to me with an expression that I had not seen upon his face in some months, a look of pure, unalloyed intellectual appetite. "Watson," he said, reaching for his coat, "I believe we must see this painting." Chapter 2 deductions at breakfast, Holmes insisted, the characteristic obstinacy of a man who has learned, through long experience, that preparation precedes success. We breakfast before proceeding to the gallery. I suspect that his true motive was less nutritional than strategic. He wished to think, and his thinking was invariably accompanied by the physical act of eating. Though he was otherwise entirely indifferent to food, he consumed 3 rashers of bacon and 2 cups of coffee with the focused inattention of a man whose mind is fully occupied elsewhere. Mrs. Wyndham Price had departed with Holmes's assurance that we would visit the gallery within the hour, and that his strict injunction that nothing should be touched, moved, or disturbed. She had agreed with the grateful acquiescence of a woman who has at last found someone she trusts to manage matters beyond her comprehension. "Well, Holmes," I ventured, as he mopped the last of his egg with a piece of toast, "it is a most singular affair." "It is a most singular beginning," he corrected, with precision. "We know almost nothing yet, Watson. We have a dead art dealer, a suspicious wife, a letter which has been destroyed, and a painting which is said to depict 3 men, of whom 2 are demonstrably dead. We do not yet know whether the painting actually resembles the deceased, or whether grief and suggestion have caused Mrs. Wyndham Price to see a resemblance that does not exist. We do not know whether the 2 other deaths are natural or otherwise. We do not know who sent the letter or what its full contents were. But surely the coincidence. There are no coincidences of significance until they have been examined," he said firmly. "The history of criminal investigation is littered with coincidences that turned out to be perfectly natural phenomena, interpreted through the distorting lens of expectation. I neither dismiss the painting as meaningless nor accept it as prophetic until I have seen it with my own eyes and applied what modest faculties I possess to its examination." He paused, and I noticed that his fingers were drumming lightly on the tablecloth, a habit which indicated, I had long since determined, not agitation, but a rapid sequential arrangement of thoughts. "However," he added more thoughtfully, "the letter is interesting. As the painting shows, so shall it be. That is not the language of a madman or a crank. It is the language of a person who wishes to convey a very specific threat, and who is confident that the recipient will understand the reference, which means that Aldous Wyndham Price already knew of the painting's peculiarity before he received the letter. "Good heavens," I said, putting down my own cup. "You think he knew the other men in it?" "I think it exceedingly probable that he not only knew them, but was himself involved in whatever circumstances brought the painting into existence. The painting came from a private estate in Devonshire, Mrs. Wyndham Price told us, 3 months ago, shortly before the first of the 3 deaths." Holmes stood abruptly, his breakfast apparently concluded to his satisfaction. "We shall want more information about that Devonshire estate before the day is done. First, the painting itself." The gallery of Wyndham Price and Associates occupied the ground floor of a handsome terraced building in Barry Street, St. James's. It had the hushed, temple-like atmosphere common to establishments which traffic in expensive objects. Thick carpets absorbed sound. The light was that particular diffused, north-facing illumination which art dealers favour, and which makes everything look simultaneously more and less real than it appears in ordinary daylight. The morning's fog had followed us here. Through the large plate-glass windows, it pressed like a grey audience against the glass. Mr. Fenton Crabbe, the assistant, met us at the door. He was a young man of perhaps 25, with a thin, anxious face, and the kind of scholarly stoop that comes from years of bending over books and catalogues. He had the manner of someone who has not slept well, and his fingers were ink-stained. The fingers, I thought, a man who does his own correspondence. He admitted us with evident relief upon hearing Holmes's name, and with the slightly proprietorial air of someone who, in the absence of the principal, has assumed a temporary authority he finds both flattering and burdensome. "The police have been," he told us, as he led us through the front gallery, past several large canvases which I had neither time nor inclination to examine properly. Inspector Lestrade sent a sergeant. They looked about for 20 minutes and concluded there was nothing to investigate. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I am myself uncertain whether there is or not." Mr. Wyndham Price was not a young man, and he had been under considerable strain of late. "What manner of strain?" was asked, with the casual air he adopted when he wished to extract information without alerting the speaker to its significance. Crabbe hesitated. "Business matters, I believe. There had been some difficulty with a particular acquisition, the Heartstone collection, which came down from a Devonshire estate. Several pieces were of uncertain provenance. Mr. Wyndham Price was concerned that if the questions were not resolved satisfactorily, the gallery's reputation might suffer." "The Heartstone collection," Holmes repeated, "and the large painting, the one in the back room. Was that part of this collection?" "Yes, it came with the rest of the lot, Mr. Wyndham Price had it valued separately. It is by an obscure painter, a man named Dorvain, who worked in the 1880s, not particularly valuable in monetary terms. But Mr. Wyndham Price refused several offers for it, which I thought strange. He insisted on keeping it." "Very strange indeed," murmured Holmes, in a tone that suggested he found it anything but strange. "Show us the painting, if you please, Mr. Crabbe." Chapter 3. The 3 Men of Dorvain. The back room of the gallery was separated from the front by a heavy velvet curtain of deep burgundy. Beyond it the atmosphere changed perceptibly. The light was dimmer here, the ceiling lower, once, and the smell of old canvas and linseed oil was stronger. Several paintings in various states of examination rested against the walls, and at the far end hung upon the principal wall with the prominence usually accorded to the most significant piece in an exhibition, the painting. It was large, perhaps 5 feet in height and 7 in width, and depicted an interior scene with a skill that immediately communicated itself to even my untrained eye as something more than competent. The setting was a panelled library or private study, richly appointed fire burning in a grate at the left side, and heavy curtains drawn across a window at the right. The light in the painting fell from an unseen source above and to the left, casting deep shadows in the corners of the room, and the general atmosphere was one of imminent confrontation. The figures were arranged in a way that conveyed tension, as though the scene represented the charged moment before some decisive action. 3 men were the subjects. 2 sat in high-backed chairs, positioned slightly apart, facing each other across a low table upon which papers were spread. The third stood slightly behind and between them, position slightly elevated. He stood upon a raised section of flooring. A step might equally have been a footstool, obscured by the composition, so that his head was above those of the seated men, crowd, a host, and his hands were raised before him, in a gesture that might have been explanatory or might have been threatening, depending upon one's interpretation. Holmes walked directly to the painting and stood before it for a long moment without speaking. Then he produced the magnifying glass he always carried and began a methodical examination, moving from left to right, from the periphery to the centre, from the seated figures to the standing one and back again. I approached the 2 seated men. I had, I confess, half expected to find Mrs. Wyndham Price identification fanciful, the product of grief acting upon a susceptible imagination, but as I looked at the face of the seated man on the left, the one turned slightly toward the viewer, I felt a distinct chill. A host. I had seen a photograph of Creighton Aldgate in the morning papers at the time of his death. Face in the painting bore a resemblance to it that was, at the very minimum, remarkable. The strong jaw, the heavy brows, the slight irregularity of the nose. These were not generic features. These were specific ones. The second seated figure was in profile, thus less immediately identifiable. But from the description I had read of Sir Roland Fenwick at the time of his death, a large man, inclined to corpulence, with a distinctive set of the shoulders. The correspondence was again unnerving, and the standing man looked out from the canvas, with an expression that was difficult to read. It might have been gravity, or authority, something darker. And his face, though it was turned slightly from the viewer, recognisably the face of the man whose portrait hung in the front gallery, identified by a small plaque as Aldous Wyndham Price, proprietor and founder. "It is them," I said quietly. "Holmes, it is actually them." "The resemblance is striking," Holmes agreed, without looking up from his examination of the lower left corner of the canvas. "Come here, Watson. Tell me what you observe about this portion of the painting." I crossed to where he stood. He was directing his magnifying glass at a portion of the canvas that, in the composition of the painting, represented the surface of the low table between the 2 seated men, the table upon which papers were spread. To the naked eye, the papers appeared to be an undifferentiated mass of documents, rendered with the loose suggestion that is common in backgrounds. Under the glass, however, I could see that the painter had, with extraordinary attention, rendered upon the topmost paper what appeared to be a document of some kind, lines of text that, while too small to read in their entirety, showed distinct lettering. "Good heavens," I murmured, "there is writing on those papers." "There is indeed. I cannot read it all. We shall need a different approach to examine it properly. But I can make out several words, and they are most suggestive." He straightened and turned to Crabbe, who had remained near the curtain, watching us with an expression of anxious curiosity. "Mr. Crabbe, I shall need a photographer to attend here this afternoon. A good one, with the capacity for detailed work. Can you arrange that?" Yes, I believe I can. There is a firm in Jermyn Street that we have used for catalogue work." "Excellent. Tell them. I require a close photograph of the centre of this canvas, specifically the table and the papers upon it, developed and printed as large as their equipment allows. Now, tell me about the Hartstone estate." Who sold the collection, and through what agency? Crabbe moved to a filing cabinet near the side wall and, after a moment's search, produced a folder. The estate belonged to the family of a Mr. Erasmus Hartstone, who died some 15 months ago. The collection was sold on behalf of the estate by a solicitor named... He looked at the folder. Mr. Creighton Aldgate. The name fell into the room like a stone into a pool. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "The same Creighton Aldgate," Holmes said softly, "who sits in the painting." "Is it?" Crabbe stared at him. "I had not thought." "You had not been invited to think it," said Holmes, with a gentle courtesy that softened what might otherwise have been a rebuke. "One further question, Mr. Crabbe. In the weeks before his death, did Mr. Wyndham Price have any visitors to the gallery who seemed to distress or agitate him?" Crabbe thought for a moment. "There was one man," he said slowly, "about 2 weeks ago. He came in the evening, after I had technically finished for the day, but I was still in the back cataloguing. I heard them in the front gallery, voices raised. I did not hear what was said. The visitor left after perhaps 20 minutes. Mr. Wyndham Price did not mention him afterward, and I did not feel it was my place to ask." "But you saw this visitor briefly as he was leaving?" "He was." Crabbe paused as though the description required care. "A large man, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, but not fashionably so, like a man who buys good quality and does not think much about styles. He had red hair, going grey at the temples, and he walked with a cane. Though I had the impression the cane was not entirely necessary, that it was something he was accustomed to carrying rather than a genuine requirement." Holmes nodded, with an expression of thoughtful satisfaction, as though this description had confirmed something he had already suspected. He turned back to the painting and looked at it for a long, silent moment. "Remarkable," he said at last. "Truly remarkable. This painting, Watson, is not a prophecy. It is a confession. The considerable difficulty, will be in proving it." Chapter 4, The Ghost Estate of Hartstone Holmes, would not explain what he meant by a confession, though I pressed him on the cab back to Baker Street. He sat with his long fingers steepled before his face, gazing at the ceiling of the cab with that expression of distant concentration which I had long since learned meant that he was following some chain, reasoning to its conclusion, and would share his findings when he was ready, and not a moment before. I occupied myself, therefore, reviewing the facts as we possessed them. 3 men were depicted in a painting that had come as part of a larger collection from a Devonshire estate. 2 of those men had subsequently died, one of apoplexy, one of unspecified natural causes. The third, the art dealer who had acquired and inexplicably refused to sell the painting, had now also died, in circumstances which his wife considered suspicious, and which the police had attributed to cardiac failure. The painting had been sold by a solicitor who was himself one of its subjects, and a threatening letter, of which only one sentence had survived, had been sent to the dead art dealer shortly before his death. By the time we reached Baker Street, I had satisfied myself of 2 things. First, that there was a genuine mystery here, and second, that I was entirely without the means to unravel it. Holmes, I suspected, already considerably further along. He spent the remainder of the morning in a manner that was, to any observer who did not know him well, apparently idle. He lounged in his armchair, played 3 or 4 bars of something mournful on his violin, and then abandoned it, read portions of several books without finishing any of them, and smoked with a focus that suggested the tobacco was serving some function other than mere recreation. He sent 3 telegrams. I noted the writing of them, but not their addresses, and received 2 replies before lunch, which he read with close attention and burned in the grate. After lunch, he became abruptly energetic. "Come, Watson," he said, pulling on his coat with a vigour that spoke of decision. "We are going to the London Library. I want everything they have on the Hartstone family of Devonshire. And after that I want to visit Doctors' Commons and examine the probate records for the estate of Erasmus Hartstone, deceased. The London Library yielded, after some searching, moderately useful portrait of the Hartstone family's history. They were Devonshire gentry of the older sort, not aristocratic, but established, roots in the county going back 4 centuries. Erasmus Hartstone, the last of the direct line, been a man of scholarly interests. A collector of art and manuscripts, a corresponding fellow of several learned societies, and, according to a brief notice in a county history, a man of considerable private fortune. Precise sources of that fortune were not clearly articulated. He had never married. He had died 15 months ago at the age of 72. His estate, in the absence of direct heirs, had passed to a trust managed by his solicitors, proceeds to go ultimately to charitable endowments. The solicitors, as we already knew, had included Mr. Creighton Aldgate. At Doctors' Commons, Holmes moved with the efficiency of a man who has spent time in such places and knows precisely how to extract what he requires from them with the minimum of friction. We examined the probate records, and Holmes noted down, in his precise small hand, several items that he clearly considered significant. I looked over his shoulder when I could, and managed to note that the estate had been valued at somewhat over £40,000, a substantial sum, and that it had included, besides the art collection, a number of commercial interests whose nature was not immediately clear from the summary documents before us. "What are those commercial interests?" I asked. "That is exactly the right question," said Holmes approvingly. "They are described here as shares and participations in various ventures as per the schedule, which is legal language, for we are not going to tell you in the public record. To discover what the schedule contains, we would need access to the private papers of the estate, which is precisely what we are not going to obtain through normal channels last afternoon." He closed his notebook. "However, I think I can make an educated inference, based on what we already know, and I shall test it this evening." "Test it how?" "By visiting Sir Rowland Fenwick's widow," he said. "She lives in Surrey, but maintains a town address in Eaton Square. I have ascertained that she is in town this week. A telegram to her this afternoon should secure us an appointment." "Psst. You telegraphed her this morning," I said with sudden comprehension, "before you knew we would be wanting her." Psst. Glanced at me, with an expression of gentle approval, as a teacher might regard a student who has at last understood a lesson he has been patiently repeating. "I telegraphed several people this morning, Watson, on the basis of what Mrs. Wyndham Price told us. It is always more efficient to prepare the ground than to dig it twice." He settled back in the cab that had waited for us. "Lady Fenwick will see us at 4 o'clock. We have time for tea." Lady Fenwick proved to be a composed, intelligent woman of about 60. Composure had the quality of long habit rather than recent achievement. She had, one felt, always been self-possessed, and the death of her husband, though clearly a grief, had not shattered any illusions she had previously harboured about the fragility of the world. She received us in a drawing-room that was handsome, without ostentation, and she listened to Holmes's carefully phrased account of his inquiries, with attention and without interruption. "Crud. You are investigating my husband's death," she said, when Holmes had finished. "I confess I have sometimes wondered whether I ought to have done the same." She paused. "What is it you wish to know?" "Lady Fenwick, in the weeks or months before your husband's death, did he show any signs of anxiety or distress connected with business affairs? Specifically, affairs connected with Devonshire." Something moved in her expression. A small, carefully controlled movement, like the first ripple in still water when something has been dropped into it at a distance. "He received a letter," she said quietly, 3 weeks before he died. "It disturbed him greatly. He would not tell me its contents. My husband, Mr. Holmes, was not in the habit of sharing business concerns with me, which I always considered rather foolish of him, but that was his nature. He burned the letter, but that evening at dinner he was different. Quiet ter. And there was something in his eyes that I had not seen before. Fear, I suggested. She considered this with the precision of a woman who weighs her words carefully. Guilt, she said. My husband had a strong sense of right and wrong, stronger than most people imagined, because he sometimes did things that appeared to contradict it. What I saw that evening was not the look of a man who is afraid of what someone else might do to him. It was the look of a man who knows that something he has done is about to be require of him. Holmes thanked her, and as we rose to leave, he asked as though in afterthought, "One small thing, Lady Fenwick. Your husband, did he walk with a cane?" She looked at him with sudden sharpness. He did not. He was an active man, very healthy, very vigorous. He had no infirmity. Quite so, said Holmes. Thank you. You have been most helpful. Chapter 5. The Photographer's Revelation. The photographs arrived the following morning, delivered by a messenger from the Jermyn Street firm, at 8 o'clock precisely, accompanied by a bill which Holmes glanced at briefly, and set aside with the serene indifference of a man whose relationship with money has never particularly troubled. The prints were large, each one nearly 2 feet in dimension, and the detail they captured was extraordinary. Firm's photographer had clearly understood that his assignment demanded the best of his considerable skill, and he had delivered it. Holmes spread the prints across the dining table, sweeping aside the remains of our breakfast, with a single comprehensive gesture that deposited them onto the sideboard and bent over them with his magnifying glass. I stood beside him, looking over his shoulder. Photographs of the full painting confirmed, in the unambiguous testimony of the photographic process, resemblances that we had observed in person. The faces of the 3 men were rendered with a precision that left no reasonable room for doubt. These were portraits of specific identifiable individuals, whatever the ostensible genre of the painting, but it was the close-up photograph of the papers on the table between the 2 seated men that commanded Holmes's primary attention. The photographer had taken this detail to range his decal at the closest equipment permitted, and had developed it to the maximum extent his equipment could manage, and the result was a print in which the lettering on the topmost paper, still far from perfectly legible, and somewhat obscured by the thickness of the paint in certain areas, was substantially more readable than it had been through the magnifying glass in the gallery. Holmes studied it in silence for perhaps 10 minutes, during which I had the wisdom to remain quiet. Then he straightened, and his face bore an expression of quiet, controlled triumph that I had seen before at moments of significant discovery. "Watson," he said, "tell me what you can read on that paper." I took the glass and bent over the photograph. The lettering rendered in the painting, with the loose precision of a skilled artist imitating handwriting rather than actually writing, was not perfectly clear, but it was substantially readable. After a moment I straightened. "I can make out what appears to be a title of some kind at the top," I said. "Looks like it says, 'Agreement of Partition,' or possibly 'Agreement of' something. I cannot make the last word. Then, below that there are what appear to be names. I can see Hearthstone clearly enough. Beneath it, what might be Aldgate. And there is a 4th name below those that I cannot read at all." "You cannot read it," said Holmes, "because the paint in that area has been deliberately worked with a blunter brush than the rest, in a manner consistent with someone having touched the wet paint after the painter had finished, smearing the lettering at that one precise point. Pause to let this sink in. The painting is a record of an agreement, Watson. A private agreement, a partition of some kind, connected with the Hearthstone estate, involving Aldgate Wyndham Price, Fenwick, and at least one other party whose name has been obscured, painter. Whoever commissioned this work, or the painter himself if he acted alone, chose to document that agreement within the painting, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as evidence. But who is the painter? This Dorvain. I spent an hour at the Public Record Office yesterday evening, after we returned from Lady Fenwick, Holmes said. A painter named Edvard Dorvain is recorded as having practised in London in the 1880s, Crabbe told us. He died in 1891. He was not well known. He made his living primarily from portraits and commissions, private work rather than exhibited pieces. He had a particular connection with Devonshire, having spent 3 years there in the earlier part of his career, and he died in circumstances that were, at the time, attributed to an accident. A fall from a cliff near a village on the Devonshire coast. The implications of this assembled themselves in my mind with a celerity that surprised even me. Holmes. Do you mean to say? I mean to say, Holmes interrupted gently, that I think this painting was commissioned by someone, or painted voluntarily by Dorvain himself, as a record of a transaction that he witnessed or was party to. And I think that Dorvain's death, like the 3 deaths we are currently investigating, may not have been the accident it appeared. He moved away from the table and stood at the window, looking out into the street below. We are dealing with something that began many years ago, Watson. The painting is old. Painted in the late 1880s, by my estimation of the style and the preparation of the canvas, which the photographer has also helpfully captured in his wider shots. Hartstone estate matter is recent. But the threads connect, and they connect through a secret that 3 men shared, which someone has now decided they shall not be permitted to take to their graves in comfortable silence. Someone, I said, who is still alive, and who has been very clever, Holmes agreed. 3 deaths, each attributed to natural causes, each with no marks of violence. Opponent is not merely clever. He is methodical, patient, and possessed of means that give him access to methods of death that leave no visible trace. He turned from the window. I have identified 4 possible methods by which a death might be engineered in the manner described for each of victims. All 4 require either chemical or pharmaceutical knowledge, or access to someone who possesses it. That narrows the field considerably, but we still do not know who the 4th name on that document is, I said. The name that has been smeared. No, said Holmes, but I have a hypothesis, and this afternoon I intend to test it. He would say no more on the subject of the hypothesis, though I pressed him, with what I flatter myself was considerable forensic skill. He was, as he so often was at moments of significant development, entirely impervious to questioning, not out of any desire to be mysterious or frustrating, but because, as he explained, when I have expressed my exasperation, he was not in the habit of advancing theories that he had not yet verified, as it led to the awkward situation of having to unmake them in public if they proved incorrect. Instead, he occupied himself with writing a long letter, which I also did not see, and with consulting a series of reference works on organic chemistry and pharmaceutical compounds that he kept in the shelves beside his chemical apparatus. He was reading, I noticed, specifically in the area of compounds derived from plant sources. Alkaloids, I thought, recalling enough of my medical training to identify the general category from the index entries I could observe. And he was making notes with the focused attention of a student preparing for an examination. In the late afternoon he went out alone, returning 2 hours later with an expression that told me the afternoon had been productive, and with a small package that he placed in his desk drawer without explanation. "Tomorrow morning," he said, settling into his armchair and reaching for his pipe. "We shall go to Devon." Chapter 6. The Manor in the Mist. The morning train to Exeter was half empty, as trains to the west often were on grey November mornings, and Holmes occupied himself with a newspaper for the first portion of the journey, and with silent thought for the remainder. I had learned, for our many years of working together, to find his silences companionable rather than awkward, to sit comfortably in the space he occupied when thinking, and to direct my own observations toward whatever presented itself to my attention. On this occasion, the landscape outside the window was providing considerable material for observation. The fog of London gradually gave way to the clearer but equally grey weather of the west, and the neat suburban streets of the city resolved into the broader, more open country of Somerset, and then Devonshire. Holmes had told me, on the platform at Paddington, that we were going to visit the Hartstone estate, specifically a portion of it that had not been included in the art sale, and which was still nominally in the control of the estate trustees. He had further told me that he had arranged, through channels he declined to specify, a meeting with the estate's surviving local agent, a man named Buxton, who had managed the property for 30 years and had remained in post during the period of the estate's administration. Following Erasmus Hartstone's death, we took a carriage from the station at Newton Abbot, the closest station to the estate, and drove for somewhat more than an hour through winding Devonshire lanes, the hedges high on either side, and the sky above a uniform grey that threatened rain without quite delivering it. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage, wrapped in his travelling coat, his eyes moving over the landscape with the observant attention he brought to all environments, however unfamiliar. The Hartstone Manor was a substantial house of grey stone, built in the late 17th century in the plain, dignified style of that period, and set in grounds that showed the evidence of recent neglect. The drives needed raking, the hedges trimmed, and the kitchen gardens, visible beyond the west wing, had gone partially to seed. It had the particular melancholy of a house that has lost its animating purpose, the melancholy of a place waiting to be decided upon. Mr. Buxton met us at the door, a solid, leathery man of about 60, with the unhurried competence of someone who has spent a lifetime managing practical affairs in the country. He received us with the cautious courtesy of a man who has been told to be helpful to 2 London gentlemen without being told quite why, and he led us to a book-lined study. Perhaps the original of the room depicted in the painting, I thought, looking around me, where he poured sherry without being asked and sat across from us with the alert, careful expression of a man who is listening very hard. Holmes dispensed with preamble. "Mr. Buxton, I shall be straightforward with you, because I believe you are a man who appreciates directness. I am investigating the deaths of 3 men, Mr. Creighton Aldgate, Sir Rowland Fenwick, and Mr. Aldous Wyndham Price. All 3 were connected with this estate through the sale of the Hartstone collection approximately 3 months ago. I believe there was a prior connection between these men and Mr. Erasmus Hartstone dating back some years. I need to understand that connection." Buxton was quiet for a moment. He looked at his sherry glass, then out the window, then back at Holmes. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and calculating whether the moment has finally come to put it down. "Mr. Hartstone," he said at last, was not a simple man. He stopped. He was a good employer, a fair man. I want that on the record, Mr. Holmes. He treated his people well, and he was generous to the village, and when he died, there were many in this county who were genuinely sorry. Another pause. Some years ago, perhaps 25 years ago, there was a matter. I don't know all of it. I know only what I observed from the position I held. And I want you to understand that I observed it, and said nothing at the time, which I have since considered at some length, and I have come to believe was wrong of me. "Tell me what you observed," said Holmes quietly. "There was a young man," Buxton said. A young man who came to work on the estate. He was perhaps 20 years old. Clever. Very clever. The kind of young man who could turn his hand to anything. He was employed initially in the stables, but Mr. Hartstone took an interest in him and brought him into the house. His name was... Buxton hesitated, then appeared to make a decision. His name was Edmund Quarry. And what happened to Edmund Quarry? That is the question, said Buxton. After about 3 years, he disappeared. Mr. Hartstone said he had left to seek his fortune in the colonies. Australia, he said. The men from London had been here. The 3 of them, Aldgate and the other 2, they came down to the estate on 3 separate occasions in the year before Quarry disappeared. They were here on business with Mr. Hartstone. Legal business, I was told. After the 3rd visit, Quarry was gone. Was there anything irregular about the circumstances of his departure? Buxton's hands tightened slightly on his sherry glass. His room, when his things were cleared, there was very little. Too little. A young man accumulates things over 3 years. There were almost none of his personal items. And another pause, longer this time, the kitchen garden. There was an area at the east end of it, by the old stone wall, where the soil was disturbed that summer. Dug over. We were told a drainage problem had been repaired, but there had been no drainage problem that I knew of, and I knew the property very well. The silence in the room was absolute for a long moment. Painter, Holmes said. Edward Dorvain, was he here during this period? Buxton's eyes widened slightly. He was, Mr. Hartstone commissioned several works. Dorvain stayed at the estate for perhaps 6 weeks, painting the library and several landscapes. He was here when... Buxton stopped. He was here when the drainage work was done. Holmes set down his untouched sherry glass. Mr. Buxton, he said, I need to see the east end of the kitchen garden. Chapter 7, Beneath the Kitchen Garden. What we found beneath the surface of the kitchen garden, the east end near the old stone wall, was not, as I had grimly anticipated, human remains. 25 years is not long in geological terms, but it is long enough for the Devonshire clay to yield certain secrets while concealing others. What Holmes found, directing Buxton's groundsman to dig carefully at 2 specific locations, he identified by a minute examination of the soil's colour and composition, was something more useful for our immediate purposes than physical evidence of a historical crime. A sealed tin box, buried approximately 18 inches below the surface. The box was badly corroded, but intact. Holmes did not open it at the sight. He wrapped it in his travelling coat and carried it to the study with the careful attention he accorded to all pieces of evidence that he considered significant. And there, at the desk that had once been Erasmus Hartstone's, and which might, I thought, have seen considerable use in the transaction depicted in the painting. He pried it open with a letter opener that Buxton produced. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had preserved them from the worst of the moisture, were several documents and a small notebook. The documents were, to my untrained eye, a mixture of legal papers and personal correspondence. Holmes examined them with rapid, concentrated attention, and as he read, I watched his expression shift through several intermediate stages. Recognition, confirmation, something that might have been satisfaction, and then, at one particular point, something darker that was not exactly anger, but was in the same territory. The notebook is Dorvain's, he said at last, without looking up. He was, as I had suspected, a witness to the events of that year. He was not merely a painter. He had a prior connection with Hartstone. He had worked for Hartstone's family in an earlier generation, and Hartstone trusted him, believed he did. What Dorvain in fact did was to observe everything with great care and record it here. He turned several pages, and then to hide the record. Why did he not come forward? Because he was afraid, Holmes said simply. He was a painter, a man without resources, without powerful connections, dependent on commissions for his living. He had witnessed, he had documented an act of... He paused, his eyes moving across the page. Yes, a conspiracy, Watson. A conspiracy involving Heartstone, Aldgate, Fenwick, and Wyndham Price to deprive a young man of his rightful inheritance. Quarry's inheritance. Edmund Quarry was, apparently, the illegitimate son of Erasmus Heartstone, Holmes said quietly. Heartstone had acknowledged this privately. There is a document here, private acknowledgement, which he had drafted and signed, and had intended to make provision for Quarry in his will. 3 men, Aldgate as the lawyer, Fenwick and Wyndham Price as witnesses to the arrangement, were originally engaged to legitimise this provision. But somewhere in the process, the decision was made to suppress it. The acknowledgement document was suppressed. Quarry was dealt with by means which are not specified in these documents, but which I think Dorvain's notebook describes in terms that leave little room for charitable interpretation. He turned another page, and the 3 men divided the benefit, not money precisely, but the value of their silence, secured through Heartstone's gratitude, and his subsequent generosity in directing business their way for the remainder of his life. And Dorvain, he painted the picture as a record. He painted it as insurance, Holmes said, and he buried this box as further insurance. He was clever. Clever enough to recognise that the painting alone might be dismissed, its evidence explained away, the combination of the painting and these documents, particularly the original acknowledgement of Quarry's parentage, which Aldgate was supposed to have destroyed, is another matter. He set the notebook aside and looked at me with an expression of focused determination. The painting was already in his studio when he died, Watson. Heartstone never received it, or if he did, he returned it. Dorvain took it back. It remained somewhere, in Dorvain's studio in a store, in private hands for decades, until somehow, recently, it came to the Heartstone estate, and from there to Aldgate's sale, and from there to Wyndham Price Gallery. But how did it come to the estate? Dorvain was dead. That, said Holmes, is the question that leads us to our living suspect. Because someone found the painting, someone who knew what it meant, who could look at those 3 faces and identify them, and who knew about Edmund Quarry. He stood, picking up the tin box and its contents with care. We are taking this with us, Watson, and when we return to London, I intend to establish the identity of Edmund Quarry's son. His son? Holmes looked at me with an expression that was almost gentle. Edmund Quarry was 20 years old when he disappeared, Watson. He had, according to what Buxton has told us, and what I can infer from Dorvain's notebook, a young woman in the village. A local girl. He is almost certainly dead, killed by, or on, the instructions of Erasmus Heartstone's advisers. But a young man of 20 with a girl in the village very commonly leaves behind a legacy that neither he nor those who arranged his fate foresaw. He moved toward the door. Edmund Quarry's child would be approximately 25 years old now, raised, possibly, without knowledge of their father's true parentage. Grown up in poverty while the men who stole their inheritance lived comfortably in London. Recently, come into possession of the knowledge that was denied them. The rain had begun outside, falling softly on the Devonshire landscape as we prepared to leave. I stood for a moment at the study window, looking out at the kitchen garden, at the stone wall, and the freshly disturbed earth beside it. And I thought about Edmund Quarry, and about the painting, and about 3 dead men who had perhaps begun to understand, in their final hours, the nature of the justice that had found them. Chapter 8. The Name That Was Smeared. We were back in London by 10 o'clock that evening, fog-wrapped and travel-weary, but in possession of evidence that had, I felt, transformed the entire character of the investigation. What had begun as a possible natural death had revealed itself, layer by layer, as a mystery rooted in an injustice of a quarter-century's duration. Holmes deposited the tin box in the inside pocket of his coat. where it produced a somewhat uncomfortable angularity, and said little on the return journey beyond indicating, at one point, that he intended to visit the office of a particular births registrar in the morning, and that I should be ready to accompany him at 8 o'clock. I was, and we went. Registrar's office was in a building of stolid Victorian purposefulness near Holborn, and Holmes navigated its systems and its human occupants with the ease of a man who has spent enough time in such places to understand their logic. Phew. We were looking, he explained to the clerk, a precise little man with steel-rimmed spectacles and the careful manner of someone who takes professional pride in the tidiness of records, for births registered in a specific parish in Devonshire in the years between 1865 and 1868. Particular attention to any birth in which the father was listed as absent or unknown. There was one, registered in August of 1866 at the parish of Stoke Hartstone. A village, I noted, that took its name from the family, was the birth of a boy named Edmund Quarry, illegitimate, mother, listed as Martha Quarry, father not recorded. The child's name was, I thought, significant. The single letter variation from Edmund might have been the result of clerical imprecision, or might have been deliberate, a small memorial gesture by a mother naming her son after his absent father. Holmes noted the details, and then, with the same clerk, traced subsequent registration events connected with this family. Martha Quarry had died in 1879. The boy would have been 13. He appeared thereafter in records associated with a charitable institution in Exeter that cared for orphaned or abandoned children of the district. He had left that institution in 1884. At the age of 18, there the trail of official records went dark. He will have continued under his own power from that point, Holmes said. We left the registrar's office. A young man of 18, raised in an institution, no family, no resources. What does such a man do in 1884? Goes into service, I suggested, or finds a trade, or educates himself, Holmes said, if he is clever. And the evidence suggests he may be. He educates himself, and he finds his way, and eventually he does well enough to begin investigating his own origins. He flagged a cab. There is another avenue I have been pursuing, Watson. Fourth name on the document in the painting. The name that was smeared. We know three of the parties to the agreement. Aldgate, Fenwick, Wyndham Price. There was a fourth. I have been assuming that the fourth party was Erasmus Hartstone himself, but I now think that assumption is wrong. Hartstone was the principal in the affair, but he would not have signed a document recording his own conspiracy. The document was written for the purposes of the three men who were receiving Hartstone's patronage, as a record of what had been agreed between them in return for their services. Fourth signature would have been a witness, someone outside the three. Dorvin himself, I suggested. Dorvin was the painter, not the legal witness. His signature on such a document would have been of uncertain value. No, the witness would have been someone of standing, someone whose presence at the meeting lent legitimacy to the arrangement, even while also making them complicit in it. He was quiet for a moment. I believe the fourth name was the name of someone who is still alive, and who is not our suspect. A fourth potential victim, or a fourth potential source of information, Holmes said. I sent an inquiry to Exeter yesterday, to a solicitor there whose name I obtained from the probate records, asking about any party to the Hartstone estate matters whose name was not immediately evident from the public documents. This morning, before we left for the registrar's office, I received a reply. He produced a telegram from his inner pocket, fourth party to any matters connected with the Hartstone estate in the relevant period, according to the Exeter solicitor's records, was a doctor, Septimus Vane, who was at that time the physician to the Hartstone family and a man of considerable local standing. He is now retired and lives apparently in Rye. "Then we must go to Rye," I said. "We must indeed, but not today. Today, Watson, I have a more immediately pressing matter." The cab had deposited us, I noticed, not at Baker Street, but in the Strand. I wished to consult the records of the Pharmaceutical Society, and after that I wished to visit a friend of mine who is a lecturer in pharmacology at King's College. I have a theory about the method of the murders that I should like to have confirmed before I proceed further. The pharmacology lecture, when we reached it, was interrupted with sufficient courtesy by Holmes, who managed to convey to the lecturer in question a Dr. Harrington Oakes, small, energetic man who received us in his laboratory amid an agreeable disorder of test tubes and reference books, that he required professional guidance on a matter of some urgency. Dr. Oakes listened to Holmes's description of the 3 deaths. The apparently natural cardiac failures, the absence of external marks, with the focused attention of an expert, being asked a question that falls within his precise competence. "There are several compounds that could produce what you describe," Oakes said, when Holmes had finished. "The most efficient, and the most difficult to detect by the methods available to a standard post-mortem examination in 1895 would be a concentrated preparation of a specific alkaloid derived from the plant aconitum, commonly known as monkhood or wolfsbane, in concentrated form, administered by any route that allows rapid absorption. It produces cardiac failure within minutes. It is virtually undetectable in the body after 24 hours, as it breaks down in the tissues rapidly. Very small quantity would be sufficient, the size of a pinhead, effectively. And how would one administer it without the victim's awareness? Great difficulty, Oakes said. Unless one had access to the victim in circumstances that allowed physical contact, preparation was in a form that could be absorbed through the skin. That is theoretically possible, but would require an extremely concentrated preparation and a suitable carrier medium. He paused. "You are describing, Mr. Holmes, very sophisticated murderer." "I am," said Holmes quietly. "Thank you, Dr. Oakes. You have confirmed what I suspected. There is one further question. Would the preparation of such a compound require specialized knowledge? Medical or pharmaceutical training? Certainly," said Oakes. "Or several years of intensive self-directed study in organic chemistry." He looked at Holmes over the rims of his spectacles. "You are looking for someone with that background?" "I have found them," said Holmes. "I am merely assembling the last pieces of the confirmation." Chapter 9. The red-haired visitor. 2 things happened simultaneously on the morning of our intended departure for Rye. Holmes received a visitor who had come without appointment, and a second letter arrived at Baker Street that cast a significant new light on events. Visitor arrived first. He was announced by Mrs. Hudson with a slightly uncertain expression that I had come to recognize as her signal for persons who did not fit neatly into the social categories she was accustomed to managing. He was, she described him, in the moment between her knock and his entrance. "A gentleman, I believe, sir, though not quite in the usual way." This turned out to be a moderately accurate assessment. He was a man of perhaps 30, tall, lean, with a kind of physical presence that comes not from size but from economy of movement. He moved with a deliberate, controlled precision that suggested long practice, as though he had at some point decided that every movement should serve a purpose, and had held to that decision ever since. His hair was dark red, fading at the temples, and his eyes were of an unusual grey-green, and his face bore the lines of someone who has thought a great deal under conditions of some hardship. He was well dressed. Holmes was right that he would have done well for himself. In a suit of good quality that he wore with the faint awkwardness, a man not entirely accustomed to such things. He carried no cane. He sat in the chair across from Holmes without being invited to, which told me something about him. And he looked at Holmes with an expression of steady, watchful assessment that might have been described as respectful if it had contained any trace of deference, which it did not. "My name," he said, "is Edmund Quarry. I believe you have been looking into certain matters that concern me." Holmes was, as always at moments of apparent surprise, entirely unruffled. He leaned back in his chair and regarded our visitor with the calm interest of a naturalist, who has been hoping a particular specimen would present itself. "I have been looking into the deaths of 3 men," he said. "Sit down, Mr. Quarry. Yes, you are already sitting. I mean to say, make yourself comfortable. I suspect this conversation will take some time." "I did not kill them," Quarry said. His voice was level, neither defensive nor aggressive. It was the voice of a man making a statement of fact. "I know you did not," said Holmes. Quarry looked at him steadily for a moment. Then something in his face shifted slightly, barely perceptibly, and I understood that whatever he had been expecting when he came to Baker Street, it had not been this. "You know," he said, "I have known for some time, or rather, I have suspected for some time and accumulated confirming evidence. Deaths of those 3 men were not of your engineering. They were killed by a 4th party, who wished either to ensure your silence or to acquire for themselves the benefit of the secret you hold. You came to London some months ago, when you discovered what was in the Hartstone estate. Specifically the painting and the documents that you had been led to by." Holmes paused. "How did you find them, Mr. Quarry? The box in the kitchen garden? You did not bury it." "No," said Quarry. He reached into his coat and produced a letter, old and much folded, which he placed on the table between them. "That arrived for me, addressed to the son of Edmund Quarry, when he is old enough to understand it, through a firm of solicitors in Exeter. It arrived on my 25th birthday, 3 years ago. It was from the painter, Dorvain. He had arranged for it to be held until that point." Holmes unfolded the letter and read it with close attention. "Dorvain was more thorough than I had credited," he murmured. "This gives the location of the box and the painting's significance, and the names of those responsible. This is what led you to the Hartstone estate, and then you contrived to ensure the painting came to London, to Wyndham Price's gallery." "I needed them to see it," Quarry said. "I needed them to understand that I knew what they had done to my father. I sent the letter, the one with the sentence about the painting. I sent one to each of the 3. He paused. "I wanted them to be afraid. I wanted them to feel what my father must have felt, did not want them dead. I wanted them to confess, to acknowledge what they had done, to make restitution." He looked down at his hands. "They died before any of that could happen." "You received no response to your letters?" "No. Aldgate died within a week, Fenwick 2 weeks after that, and then Wyndham Price." He raised his eyes to Holmes. "Someone is killing them, Mr. Holmes, to prevent them from talking. To prevent me from getting a confession. And I do not know who." Holmes nodded slowly. He had, I suspected, already formed a very clear idea of who, but his expression gave nothing away. "Tell me," he said, "about your life between the institution in Exeter and your arrival in London." What followed was a biographical sketch that explained, broad strokes, the man before us. After leaving the institution at 18, Quarry had educated himself voraciously, systematically, the determined ferocity of someone who knows that education is the only currency he possesses. He had worked in an apothecary in Exeter, then in a chemical manufacturer in Bristol, then had saved enough to spend 3 years at a polytechnic in Germany, studying chemistry. He had returned to England and built a modest but successful career as an industrial chemist. He had never married. He had spent 20 years, he told us, carrying the knowledge of his origins as a quiet, unspecific ache, until Dorvain's letter arrived and gave the ache a shape. "There is a 4th party," Holmes said when Quarry had finished. "A Dr. Septimus Vane. who was a witness to the original agreement. He is still alive in Rye. He may be in danger. And Holmes paused. With the careful deliberation of a man choosing words with precision, he may also be able to identify the person who killed the 3 men. For I believe the killer had access to the private papers of at least one of the victims. Papers which included correspondence about your letters, which the 3 men must have exchanged among themselves when they received them. Killer knew you had sent the letters. The killer may, in fact, have been in regular contact with one or more of the victims. Quarry was very still. Who do you think it is? Holmes looked at him for a long, measuring moment. I think, he said, that the answer may surprise you. I should like you to come with us to Rye, Chapter 10. The Doctor in the Dunes Rye, in November, was a town reduced to its bones by the season. The summer visitors gone, the cafes shuttered, the streets given over to the solid, unhurried business of permanent residents who had the town to themselves and seemed to find this condition entirely agreeable. It sat on its small hill above the marsh, with the quiet self-possession of a place that has existed long enough to know that seasons pass and return, and that outlasting things is its own form of dignity. Dr. Septimus Vane lived in a house near the church, neat Georgian building that he had evidently inhabited for many years, judging by the particular quality of comfortable permanence that adhered to its furnishings and gardens. He was a man of 70 or thereabouts, white-haired and slightly stooped, but with eyes of considerable intelligence and alertness that watched our arrival from the window before we had reached his front step. He had been warned by Holmes's telegram the day before that visitors were coming to discuss the Heartstone affair. He had replied with a single word. Come, this response told Holmes, who communicated as much to Quarry and myself on the train, a great deal, that Vane had been expecting this eventually, had perhaps been waiting for it, that he was unlikely to be evasive once conversation was opened. He received us in a sitting room that smelled pleasantly of wood smoke and old books, and he looked at Edmund Quarry for a long silent moment before saying, not to Holmes or to me, but to Quarry directly, you have your father's eyes, the same grey-green. I noticed it the moment I looked at him, first time they brought me in. Quarry said nothing, but the quality of his stillness changed. I am going to tell you everything, Vane said, addressing all 3 of us now, but still with his gaze resting most heavily on Quarry. I have been composing this account in my mind for 25 years. I have waited in that time for someone to come and ask me for it. And I confess I am relieved that they finally have. He settled into his chair. I served as physician to the Heartstone estate for 15 years. Erasmus Heartstone was my patient, and eventually my friend, or so I believed. When he came to me and told me about the boy, I was glad for him. I thought it was an act of decency long overdue. He had acknowledged the child privately, had made the papers, had arranged for proper provision. I agreed to witness the arrangement. The document that set out what was to happen, what each of the men involved, Aldgate, Fenwick, Wyndham Price, was to receive in return for facilitating the legal process. And then, Holmes asked, and then something changed. Do not know precisely what. I believe money was at the root of it, as it generally is. The legitimate heir would have taken a substantial portion of the estate. 3 men convinced Heartstone that the risk was too great, that an illegitimate acknowledgement could be contested, that the family name would suffer, that the boy was better off without the burden of it. They persuaded him and Heartstone, who was not, when all is said, a man of strong will, despite his surface authority, was persuaded. The document was supposed to be returned to me to be destroyed. I was not informed that the decision had changed until after the boy was gone. He stopped. Silence fell upon the room that was of a different quality from ordinary silence, heavier, the kind of silence that surrounds events that were unspeakable when they happened and have remained so. Gone, Holmes said carefully. Boy dead, Dr. Vane? Vane looked at Quarry. Your father, he said. I believe so. I cannot prove it. I was not present. What I know is that a man went into that estate in the autumn of 1866 and did not come out. 3 men are dead, and cannot now account for what they did. That is the truth, as far as I possess it. He drew a long breath. I said nothing, Mr. Holmes. That is my sin, and I have lived with it. I was afraid of those men, afraid of Heartstone, afraid of what would become of me if I spoke. I kept the original document. I did not surrender it when asked, because I thought it might one day be necessary. I have it still. You have it, Holmes said with quiet emphasis. The original acknowledgement of Quarry's parentage, signed by Heartstone. Yes. That document, combined with what we retrieved from the kitchen garden, constitutes a legal case for the rightful inheritance of Mr. Edmund Quarry. The son, assuming the estate has not been entirely dispersed. He looked at Quarry. That is a matter for the lawyers, but it is not the matter that brings us here today. He turned back to Vane. Dr. Vane. Who else knew about this arrangement? Who else, besides the 4 signatories, the deceased Heartstone, and the deceased Dorvane, was in possession of the knowledge of what was done to Edmund Quarry? Vane was quiet for a moment. There was a 5th person, he said, not present at the original meeting, but informed of it subsequently. Aldgate had a clerk, a very able, very devoted clerk, managed all of his private affairs. A man named Silas Crabbe. Holmes sat forward almost imperceptibly. I noticed it because I had spent years learning the language of his body. Crabbe, he said. And does this Silas Crabbe have a son? He does, said Vane with a puzzled look. Or had. I have not kept track of the family. A son named Fenton, I believe, who was said to be a clever young man. Aldgate took an interest in him, helped advance him. Helped him, Holmes said, to a position as gallery assistant to Mr. Aldous Wyndham Price. Chapter 11. The trap is set. On the return journey from Rye, Holmes was at his most concentrated and most silent, which was, paradoxically, the most eloquent state he ever occupied. Quarry sat across from me in the compartment, looking out at the Kentish landscape, with an expression that I could not fully read. Something between relief and grief, the expression of a man who has received an answer to a question he has lived with for 25 years, and is discovering that answers, long-sought ones, carry their own weight. I turned over what we now knew. Fenton Crabbe, young, anxious, scholarly Fenton Crabbe, who had been in the gallery the morning Wyndham Price's body was discovered, who had told us about the red-haired visitor without us asking, who had been positioned by Aldgate, his father's old employer and patron, in the gallery of one of the 3 men who had committed the original wrong. Crabbe, whose father had been privy to the knowledge of what Aldgate's group had done, and had apparently passed that knowledge on. Crabbe, who had been close to all 3 victims, and who had, in each case, been in a position to administer the sort of compound that Dr. Oakes had described. But the motive, I thought, the motive was the puzzle. Crabbe was not Edmund Quarry's son. He had not been wronged. Why would he kill 3 men to prevent a truth from emerging? A truth that had been concealed for 25 years, and, if anything, would seem to embarrass, rather than benefit the Crabbe family, whose patriarch had been a party to the concealment. I voiced this difficulty to Holmes on the train, and he turned from the window with an expression of approval. Exactly the right question, he said. And the answer, I think, is this. Fenton Crabbe did not kill those men to prevent the truth. He killed them in order to inherit. I stared at him. Inherit? He is not a legal heir to any of the parties, Holmes agreed. But consider his position. He is installed, by Aldgate's patronage, in Wyndham Price's gallery. He has access to the correspondence of all 3 men. For Aldgate, I have established, employed him first, and used him as a general factotum, privy to many of his private affairs. including the exchange of letters among the three when Quarry's communications arrived. He understood, perhaps before any of the three victims fully did, the danger that Quarry's discovery posed to them, and he saw, I believe, an opportunity, not to protect them, but to position himself as the inheritor of their secrets. What secrets? They would die with the men. Not quite. Fenton Crabbe's father, Silas, was apparently in possession of a copy of certain documents. Copies made, perhaps, the insurance of a loyal clerk who wanted to ensure he retained some leverage with his employer. Fenton Crabbe had access to those copies, and with the three original parties dead, unable to contradict, to confess, to negotiate, those copies became considerably more valuable, because the estate of each of the deceased men, if it could be demonstrated that they had been party to a fraud of the kind described, could be the subject of legal action. And a man who held evidence of that fraud, and who had positioned himself as the apparent discoverer and champion of the aggrieved martyred party. Holmes stopped. He was going to use Quarry's cause to extract money from the estates, I said slowly. He was going to present himself as the man who had uncovered the truth, with the evidence to prove it, and claim some kind of consideration. Or simply blackmail the survivors of the deceased into silence in return for the evidence not being used. Either way, the three principals dead, there is no one left to expose his role, or his father's role, in the original concealment. The father was complicit. But if the father is also dead, and the son emerges as the champion of justice? Holmes shrugged. It is a scheme of considerable ingenuity, Watson, and it very nearly worked. Indeed, it would have worked had Mrs. Wyndham Price not come to Baker Street. Quarry had been listening to this with an expression of progressive, controlled outrage. He used my father's murder, he said very quietly. He used it as a business opportunity. He did, Holmes said, and I am sorry for it, but he has not yet achieved his goal. He does not yet know that we have made the connections that we have, and that gives us an advantage. Plan Holmes laid was, in its essentials, simple, but it required a quality of nerve on the part of its participants that is not equally distributed among humanity. The plan was this. Quarry would return to the gallery under the pretext of seeking information about a sale, a thin pretext, but sufficient to get him through the door. Holmes would be present in disguise in the back room of the gallery, having arranged access through a rear entrance with the cooperation of Mrs. Wyndham Price, who had been briefed that morning by telegram. Inspector Lestrade, who Holmes had contacted on the train back from Rye, would have two of his men stationed in Bury Street, ready to enter on a signal. The signal would be Holmes's whistle, 3 short blasts, which he was capable of producing at a volume that would carry through a closed door. You are expecting Crabbe to do something violent when he realizes Quarry knows the truth, I said. I am expecting him to attempt it, Holmes said. He has the compound. I believe he has been preparing it since he received warning that Quarry was in London, probably from correspondence he intercepted at the gallery. He will have it on his person, in a form suitable for rapid administration, when he believes himself cornered, or when he believes he has found the perfect moment, he will try to use it. And if you are wrong? Holmes looked at me with calm certainty. I am not wrong, he said. But if some element of the execution goes amiss, you will be at the front door, Watson, and you will intervene if necessary. I rely on your judgment and your medical training, as I always have. I checked my revolver in the cab. Holmes became beside me, a remarkably convincing specimen of a retired naval officer, and I reflected, not for the first time, that his capacity for physical transformation was among the most extraordinary of his many extraordinary gifts. Chapter 12. The Confession at Knife Point. The gallery of Wyndham Price and Associates on the following morning presented, from the outside, customary aspect of expensive quietude. The fog was back. London's fog, which had become almost a character in this affair, present at every significant moment, as though it had taken an interest in the proceedings. Holmes had been in position in the back room for 2 hours before Quarry arrived. He had entered through the service lane at the rear of the building at 7:30, before Crabbe arrived to open the gallery at 9. I stood across street, in the doorway of a bootmaker's shop, whose proprietor, a stoic individual named Flett, had been persuaded by a combination of Holmes's charm and a reasonable consideration to tolerate my presence among his samples. From this position, I had a clear view of the gallery's front door and the street in both directions. Lestrade and 2 constables were stationed, rather too obviously, in my private opinion, at the end of the street. But Holmes had said that some visible police presence was not necessarily a disadvantage, as it would increase Crabbe's sense of urgency and reduce his capacity for calm deliberation. Quarry arrived at 10:05. He entered without hesitation. This man was not, I reflected, deficient in nerve, and the door closed behind him. I waited. Inside the gallery, Holmes subsequently described it to me. The encounter unfolded with considerable rapidity once it was begun. Quarry had presented himself to Crabbe with a directness that must have been startling. He had, apparently, dispensed entirely with the pretext of being a buyer, and had simply said, standing in the middle of the front gallery, "I know what you have done. I know about your father's papers, and I know what you put in the drinks of those 3 men." Crabbe had, at this direct challenge, gone very pale. Then he had done something that revealed the character behind the anxious scholarly surface. He had smiled. It was, by Holmes's account, not a pleasant smile. The smile of a man whose mask has been removed, and who is not entirely displeased that the necessity for wearing it has passed. "You know," Crabbe said, "and yet you have come here alone. That tells me, Mr. Quarry, you have not yet shared this knowledge with anyone whose capacity to act upon it would inconvenience me." "I have shared it with Sherlock Holmes," Quarry said. The smile faded. "Holmes is not here. Are you certain of that? And Holmes," this point, timing it with the dramatic precision that was, I always suspected, one of the private pleasures of his work, had drawn aside the velvet curtain from the back room and stepped through it. What happened in the next 60 seconds was rapid, and might have been disastrous. Crabbe's hand moved to his coat pocket with the instinctive quickness of a man who has been rehearsing this possibility. Holmes had anticipated this movement, was already crossing the room, and what he had in his own hand was not a weapon, but a glass vessel. A small glass vial, sealed with wax, which he held up and said with absolute calm, "The compound in your pocket, Mr. Crabbe, has been replaced. You will find. There is a preparation of sugar in water, which I substituted during the 30 minutes I spent in your coat pockets this morning, while you were in the front gallery attending to the Morning Post." Crabbe's hand froze. He looked at Holmes with an expression in which fury and assessment were equally balanced. "The original preparation," Holmes continued, setting the glass vial carefully on the nearest flat surface, a small occasional table that held a vase of flowers, "is here, in this vial, which I have sealed and labelled, and which will go directly to Dr. Oakes of King's College, who will confirm its composition. Combined with the confession of Dr. Septimus Vane, the documents covered from the Hartstone kitchen garden, and the testimony of Mr. Edmund Quarry, it constitutes sufficient evidence for a trial on 3 counts of murder." Crabbe did not move. He was a man calculating his options with great rapidity, and the calculation was clearly not producing encouraging results. "You have no direct evidence," he said. "You have a compound which proves nothing about its use. You have old papers about a matter that has nothing to do with me. You have an old man's confession about events of 25 years ago. I also have," Holmes said, "the complete correspondence between yourself and Mr. Creighton Aldgate, which includes several letters in which you discuss, in language that is careful but not careful enough, the problem of Mr. Quarry's inquiry, and the measures being considered to address it. I retrieved that correspondence from Aldgate's private papers this morning before coming here. I had the cooperation of his estate's executor, who has been fully informed of the situation. The silence was absolute. Then Crabbe sat down, not in surrender exactly, but with the manner of a man who has exhausted his immediate resources and requires a moment to consider what remains available to him. And in that moment of consideration, in that interval of suspended stillness, there came from outside 3 short, piercing blasts of Holmes's whistle, which he had somehow managed to produce without any visible preliminary action, and Lestrade's men were at the door within 30 seconds. Crabbe said nothing during the arrest. He had recovered his composure with remarkable rapidity, and he went with the constables with the quiet, cooperative surface that had presumably served him well throughout his career in the gallery and his father's career before him. Holmes watched him go with an expression of mild, tired satisfaction. "Was any of it true?" Quarry asked when Crabbe and the constables had gone. "Correspondence from Aldgate's papers? The substitution of the compound?" Holmes looked at him with the ghost of a smile. "The correspondence exists," he said. "I had not actually retrieved it. That part was slightly in advance of the facts, but it will be retrieved today, now that Lestrade has grounds to search. As for the compound," he picked up the glass vial. "This is indeed what I took from his pocket, and it is indeed the preparation I believe Crabbe has been carrying. Whether it is the preparation that killed 3 men, Dr. Oakes will tell us." He paused. "I did not in fact replace it. I merely told Crabbe that I had human tendency to believe the confident statement of a man who appears to know more than oneself is, in my experience, one of the most reliable constants in criminal investigation." Chapter 13. The Web Unravelled. The days that followed the arrest of Fenton Crabbe were occupied with the mechanics of justice. The formal statement of charges, the gathering of evidence, the interviews and depositions and legal consultations that constitute the administrative aftermath of a solved mystery. Holmes participated in these proceedings with efficient cooperation and occasional impatience, being temperamentally better suited to the discovery of truth than to its subsequent codification, but acknowledging that the codification had its necessity. I shall record here, for the sake of the complete picture, the connections that Holmes laid out for Lestrade, and subsequently for me, in the sitting room at Baker Street on the evening after Crabbe's arrest. The full account of the affair from beginning to end, which I have been attempting to convey throughout this narrative, but which, heard from Holmes himself, had the quality of a mechanism suddenly revealed to be complete. Every part in its correct position, everything fitting with the satisfying precision that at his best solutions always achieved. The origin of the matter was, as we now knew, the conspiracy of Hartstone, and his 3 advisers against the young Edmund Quarry in the autumn of 1866. Quarry had been disposed of, Holmes believed killed, though the precise means and disposal of the body were likely never to be established, and his mother had died in poverty, 13 years later, leaving their son in an institution. Dorvain, the painter, had witnessed what he had witnessed, recorded it in his notebook, and encoded a further record in the painting itself, and had buried both in the kitchen garden as insurance. The painting had remained in his studio or in storage for the remainder of his life. Dorvain died in 1891, falling from a cliff in Devonshire in circumstances that were attributed to an accident, but which Holmes considered suspicious. His possessions had been dispersed. The painting came to the Hartstone estate, Holmes explained, not through deliberate design, but through accident. Dorvain had willed his professional contents to the estate itself, in a final irony that he perhaps intended. Heartstone, by that point an old man who had spent decades suppressing his guilt, received it and recognised immediately what it depicted. He stored it, could not bring himself to destroy it, and when he died it was catalogued as part of the collection and sold, along with everything else, by Aldgate's firm. Who had every reason to get rid of it quickly, I said. Exactly. Aldgate recognised it the moment he saw it. He was one of the subjects, after all, and arranged the sale as quickly as he could, hoping to disperse it to some distant collection where it would be forgotten. Instead, by the considerable misfortune that occasionally governs human affairs, it came to Wyndham Price, who also recognised it, and, unlike Aldgate, could not bring himself to pass it on. He kept it for reasons that were perhaps partly guilt and partly a strange, muted acknowledgement of what it represented. And Dorvain's letter arrived to find the young quarry, I said. 3 years ago, at which point Quarry, who had made a respectable career as a chemist, which is rather interesting given subsequent events, spent 2 years following the trail, found the box, understood the painting, and came to London. He sent his letters to the 3 men, and waited for a response. The letters terrified them, but they also fatally showed the letters to Fenton Crabbe. Why would they do that? Because Crabbe had been their confidential factotum in all matters relating to Quarry's inquiry. He had been intercepting and managing such correspondence, on Aldgate's behalf initially, then more broadly, for some time. When the letters arrived, they turned to him, as they always had, for management of the difficulty, and Crabbe, who had spent years in close proximity to the truth of what his father and these men had done, and who had formed his own plans regarding what advantage might be extracted from that truth. Crabbe recognised his opportunity. He killed them before they could confess, I said, because a live confession, recorded and attested, would include his own father's complicity. With them dead, he controlled the evidence, and could position himself as the champion of the aggrieved party, Holmes agreed, producing, at the appropriate moment, the copies of the documents that his father had kept, and presenting them to Quarry in return for what portion of any inheritance recovered? Money? A clean reputation for the Crabbe family, presented as having done the right thing in the end? He shrugged. We shall learn his precise intention in due course. For now, it is sufficient that he is in custody and will face the appropriate proceedings. The pharmaceutical evidence proved, as Holmes had predicted, entirely damning. Dr. Oakes examined the contents of the vial and confirmed it as a concentrated preparation of aconitine, present in a quantity, and form consistent with Holmes's description of the method. Further examination of the gallery's storage areas, conducted by Lestrade's people the following day after Crabbe's arrest, revealed the materials for preparing the compound, including a quantity of dried aconitum root and the chemical apparatus for its extraction, concealed behind a false panel in the storage room at the back of the gallery. The letters retrieved from Aldgate's papers, when fully examined, proved even more explicit than Holmes had indicated. They discussed the problem of Quarry in terms that, while not directly incriminating, were sufficiently suggestive in conjunction with the other evidence to form a substantial part of the prosecution's case. There was, I should record, one further piece of evidence that Holmes considered particularly elegant, in Dorvain's notebook. The notebook from the tin box. There was a passage, written in the painter's deliberate hand, that described in precise terms what he had seen in the east wing of the manor house on the night of Edmund Quarry's disappearance. The 3 men, the single figure between them, and the document upon the table. It was the description, in words, what the painting depicted in images. The same scene recorded in 2 media by a man who understood that truth sometimes requires more than one form to survive, Chapter 14. The Inheritance of Ashes. The trial of Fenton Crabbe occupied the better part of 3 weeks, during which I visited the proceedings on several occasions, and Holmes attended precisely once. On the day that the evidence from the Heartstone tin box was formally presented, after which he declared himself satisfied, and returned to Baker Street to pursue a chemical experiment that he had been deferring throughout the investigation. The verdict was, in all the relevant particulars, as Holmes had predicted from the outset. Crabbe was convicted on 3 counts of murder, the evidence being, in the judgment of the court, and in my own, essentially complete. The method of the aconitine, the possession of the materials, the letters from Aldgate's papers, and the testimony of Dr. X. On the pharmacological evidence, all combined to form a case that Crabbe's advocates, who were able and determined men, could not successfully challenge. There was one moment in the proceedings that I shall record, because it illuminated something about Crabbe's character that was not otherwise easily seen, peaked, when the evidence of the painting was formally presented. When the large photograph was placed before the court, and its implications explained, 3 faces of the victims depicted in a work, painted a decade before their deaths. Crabbe looked at it for a long moment with an expression that, almost for a fraction of a second, something like appreciation. The expression passed immediately, replaced by the careful blankness that he maintained throughout. But I saw it, and I thought about it afterward, and I concluded that whatever else Fenton Crabbe was, he had recognised the painting for what it was, a remarkable thing, record of human wickedness encoded in art, surviving against all probability to play its designated role in the eventual accounting. The matter of Edmund Quarry's inheritance proved more complex than the matter of Crabbe's trial, as such things invariably do. The legal mechanisms involved were intricate and slow, and I shall not attempt to describe them in detail, as they engaged the energies of several firms of solicitors over a period of months, and produced a quantity of documentation that would have tested even Holmes's patience to read. What I can record is the broad outcome. Quarry recovered a portion, not the whole, as the estate had been substantially dispersed in the intervening years, but a significant portion of what his father had been deprived of. Documents from the tin box, combined with the testimony of Dr. Vane and the surviving original acknowledgement, established the legal claim with sufficient clarity to persuade the courts that justice was, however, belatedly owed. Holmes and I called upon Quarry once during this process, on an afternoon in December, when the streets outside were beginning to show the first genuine cold of the winter, and Baker Street had taken on its most agreeable aspect of warmth and enclosure. He received us in the rooms he had taken in Bloomsbury. Modest, neat, arranged with the careful economy of a man who has not been accustomed to space, and has not yet formed habits of excess. He thanked Holmes with a directness and lack of ceremony that I found characteristically fitting. "You did not have to come to Rye with us," Holmes said. "That took courage. My father came to that house," Quarry said, "and was never permitted to leave it. I thought it only proper to go there myself and leave under my own power." He was, I thought as we departed, a man who had suffered what would have broken many. The deliberate erasure of his own origins, the poverty of his childhood, the institutional coldness of his adolescence, and had not been broken. He had been shaped, instead, into someone of unusual resolution. Whether the inheritance, when it came, would bring him anything that the years of its absence had not already rendered unnecessary, I did not know. There are forms of settlement that arrive too late to fill the space they were intended for, and yet are not entirely without meaning. Dr. Septimus Vane died in February of the following year, quietly, at home in Rye, attended by a local physician, who reported nothing remarkable about his passing. He had lived long enough to give his testimony in the legal proceedings, and to receive, from Quarry, formal communication acknowledging the value of it. Whether he had lived long enough to make his peace with himself was a question that no external observer could answer. Mrs. Wyndham Price managed the affairs of the gallery with considerable competence in the months following her husband's death, and eventually, I understand, sold the business and the premises to a larger establishment, retaining for herself a comfortable independence. Painting, the subject of the whole extraordinary affair, she donated, at Quarry's suggestion, to a small institution in Devonshire that worked for the welfare of children without family. It hangs there still, I believe, in the entrance hall, where visitors occasionally stop to examine it with puzzled attention, wondering at the tension in the three figures, at the papers on the table, the quality of intensity that the painter Dorvain encoded in every brush stroke, wondering, without being able to name their wonder, what transaction it was that he witnessed and recorded in oil and pigment, and why it seems to demand, even now, that anyone who looks at it long enough should feel, with faint discomfort, that they are looking not at history, but at something not entirely finished. Chapter 15, Holmes at Candlelight. It was perhaps a fortnight after the conclusion of all the formal proceedings connected with the Crabbe trial and the Quarry inheritance that I returned to Baker Street on an evening in late January to find Holmes at his most characteristic occupation, seated in his armchair, in the half-light, the fire reduced to comfortable coals, his pipe drawing steadily, and around him the ordered disorder of his various papers and projects in their usual state of elaborate disarray. He had been, I knew, without a case for 11 days, or without a case that he considered worthy of significant engagement. There had been several minor matters that he had dispatched with almost contemptuous efficiency, returning to Baker Street within hours on each occasion with the expression of a man who has been offered something he considers well below his palate. The long periods of inactivity that settled upon him between major investigations were always a source of some concern to me, as they tended to produce the black moods and the chemical experiments, and, in the earlier years of our acquaintance, the recourse to stimulants that I had always deprecated. On this evening, however, he seemed, if not precisely contented. Contentment was not quite the right word for any state that Holmes inhabited, then at least peacefully engaged with his thoughts. He had evidently been reading, as a book lay open face down on the arm of his chair, and he had evidently been thinking pipe was burned rather lower than it had been when he first filled it. "Watson," he said, without looking up as I entered, "pour yourself a whisky, and sit down. I have been thinking about the Quarry business." I did as instructed, and settled into my own chair across from him. "What aspect of it has been occupying you?" "The painting," he said. "Specifically Dorvain, I find myself with an unusual sympathy for the man." This surprised me. Holmes's sympathies, when they manifested at all, were generally reserved for the victims of crimes, or for persons who demonstrated ingenuity of some kind. He did not often express fellow feeling for those peripheral to a case. "In what respect?" I asked. He was placed in an impossible position, said. He knew the truth. He had the evidence. He was neither powerful enough to bring it forward openly, nor, at that moment, courageous enough to try. So he did what a man of intelligence does when conventional routes are closed to him. He found another route. He encoded the truth in a form that would outlast him. He buried the documentary evidence. He arranged for the letter to reach Quarry at the appropriate time, and then he died, probably killed, as I have always believed, by the same people whose actions he had recorded. He drew on his pipe. "The painting survived for 30 years, Watson. 30 years in various hands, surviving through luck and circumstance, and the curious reluctance of heartstone and then Wyndham Price to destroy it, and it served in the end precisely the purpose for which it was painted. You have a respect for it, I said. I have a respect for any piece of evidence that survives long enough to do its work. Holmes said. Most evidence does not. Most truth, frankly, not. It is buried, not in kitchen gardens, but in the weight of convenience and the discomfort of consequence, and the simple passage of time which erodes justice as readily as it erodes stone. He looked at me for a moment. The Quarry case interested me for many reasons, Watson, but I confess that one of them was unusual. Most cases present a crime committed in the recent past, requiring the reconstruction of recent events. This one required the reconstruction of events from a quarter-century ago, involving a man long dead and a wrong that had had 30 years to settle into apparent permanence. And it disturbs you that such things can be arranged to appear permanent, I asked. It interests me, he corrected. Disturbed is not quite the word. I am not disturbed by evidence of human wickedness. I encounter it with sufficient regularity to have made a working accommodation with its existence. What interests me, what will always interest me, is the nature of the evidence that defeats it. In this case, a painting. The one thing that the three men could not bring themselves to destroy, and the one thing that connected all the threads. He set down his pipe. Art, Watson, is a form of truth-telling that operates by different rules from the ones that govern confessions and sworn statements. It can contain what testimony cannot. It can survive when documents are burned, and this is the aspect that I find most intellectually satisfying. It cannot lie in the same way that a person can. Dorvain looked at those three men and what they had done, and he painted what he saw. The painting is a true thing. It has always been a true thing. Difficulty was merely in knowing how to read it. I looked at him for a moment, at the familiar figure in the familiar chair, with the firelight on his face, and the grey fog pressing against the windows outside, and I thought about the question of truth-telling and its various forms, and about the painting hanging in its institution in Devonshire, in a hallway where children without families passed it every day. What do you make of Quarry? I asked. As a man, Holmes considered this with genuine attention. I make of him what I make of anyone who has been required by circumstance to become harder than they would otherwise have chosen to be, and who has managed the process without losing the essential thread of what they are. He is a formidable man. He will be a useful one, if he is given the right scope. He paused. I rather hope he finds his way to something productive with his chemistry. Field needs people who have reasons to take it seriously. We sat in companionable silence for a time. Outside, a hansom cab rattled along Baker Street, its driver invisible in the fog, its lamps making two small blurs of orange in the grey. Somewhere in the distance a clock struck 9. Holmes, I said, you never did explain to me how you knew, on the very first morning, that the footsteps on the stair were those of a woman who had been weeping. He looked at me with an expression of pure amusement. That rare, unguarded expression, which was, I always thought, the truest portrait of the man, more faithful than any photograph. I did not know, Watson, he said serenely. I observed a shadow moving past the frosted glass of the door, and from the quality of the movement I inferred a degree of hesitation consistent with emotional distress. The rest was informed supposition, based on the character of the footsteps themselves. Slightly slower than purposeful, slightly heavier than casual, and the observation that Mrs. Hudson had paused before announcing the visitor, which she does only when the visitor has needed a moment to compose themselves. So it was not supernatural at all. It is never supernatural, he said. Only observation, only attention. The world presents itself with perfect transparency to anyone who cares to look at it with sufficient exactness. Most people, he added, reaching for his bow and his violin with the ease of long habit, simply cannot be bothered. He began to play. Something slow and thoughtful that I did not recognize, which might have been composition, or might have been improvisation, as his playing often inhabited the space between them. And I listened, and the fire settled, and the fog moved outside the window, and the case of the painting that predicted 3 murders settled into the past. Where all things go when they are finished, they are never entirely done with us.